In this video tutorial, we'll be discussing how to create, scan, define, and use your own custom brush tips in Photoshop. So the first step in creating your own custom paintbrush textures is to create your own custom paint strokes. Now this is real media stuff, so it's really a brush with paint on paper. In this example here, I just used a small can of regular touch-up house wall paint. I actually recommend using high gloss photo paper for this. Now your instinct might be to use canvas. You think, well, painters paint on canvas, that would be the natural thing to do. The problem with using canvas or any type of textured medium is that when you scan it in, that texture comes through into the scan and it's very difficult to remove, and you end up having sort of a texture built into the paint stroke, which sounds good until you actually try to use it, and then that texture starts to overlap on itself and starts to repeat and just becomes a real mess digitally. So this high gloss photo paper has no visible texture to it when you scan it in. It scans in as a nice stark white, just like most papers would, but with the high gloss like this, it resists the paint, as in it doesn't absorb it in and start to bubble and warp like a more matte finished or standard type of paper would. So the high gloss, regular paint, a couple of paint strokes, it's really a lot of fun to create your own paint stroke textures just like this. So the next step after you've created your paint on paper masterpieces is to scan them in. I highly recommend that you let the paint dry first, otherwise you will mess up the flatbed glass of your scanner, and if you're willing to do that, then really there was no point in even using the paper. You could have just painted directly on the scanner glass itself, and then you'd always have that texture right there to scan in. In fact, you'd see it on every single thing you scanned. But I don't recommend that, and you probably don't really want to do that anyway. So you let the paint dry and you scan it into Photoshop here. Now a couple of recommendations when scanning is to scan it in as a nice high resolution. Scan it in at, say, 300 dpi or better. I scanned this one in color. Ultimately, the files we use will be a grayscale file, and you may scan in black and white if you care to. I just was more comfortable doing the scan itself in color and then pulling the color information out in Photoshop. Clean the glass between each scan just in case some of the paint chips off or flakes off onto the glass, so that you can get a nice assortment of good brush strokes to be scanned in and used here in Photoshop. So let's select one of these to begin with. I really like this long curvy looking stroke here. I think that's pretty neat. I think that'll make for a neat paint stroke to work with. So the thing to do first of all, like I mentioned before, is reduce this to a grayscale file or remove the color information from it, because the paintbrush tips disregard color information anyway, because you assign the color to the paintbrush tip, so it shouldn't have color already built into it. We'll go to Image, Adjustments, Desaturate, right there. Okay. Now, so that pulls it into a grayish look with sort of a pale gray background. We need the background to be a stark white, and if the paint strokes are a little darker, that would work out a lot better for us. So let's go back to Image, Adjustments, and bring up the Levels command. Now looking at the histogram here, let's pull this left one over, which is going to darken all those paint strokes. Now, at this point, you want to be careful not to go into where the histogram is, because what that's going to do is generate a not white background there. You want to stop this handle just to the left of the furthest point of that histogram. You bring this right one over, and this will lighten up that background, and then it's just a matter of taste, really. Let's keep it, say, about there. All right, now I'm going to select my polygonal lasso tool and just roughly click around this one paint stroke here. You go to Edit, Copy, File, New, Edit, Paste. And we get it all right in there. Now is the time that you want to go in and clean up any stray marks that you might see in here. Like if there was a hair that was in the paint, perhaps, or if there was a little scratch or something on the glass. This is the point you'd like to clean that up. Now this one is looking pretty clean, but let's go ahead and say clean some of it up anyway. We'll grab a regular paintbrush, do a default colors. I hit the D key to default the colors. Now I'm going to swap them over here to use a white foreground. Bring it down here, make sure my opacity is all the way up. Mode set to normal, and let's just paint over maybe that one little piece there. Let's say I didn't want that. Okay, now sometimes when you do the selection and cut and paste into a new image like this, you'll get some, looks like angular gray areas. We didn't get that here. When that happens, what's going on is that the area in the background here isn't fully white, but there's some gray gradients sort of built into it. Sometimes that happens when you scan. The thing to do, if you see that happening, is you open up your curves or levels adjustment. So let's say we go to Image, Adjustment, Curves. All right, and you see this little white eyedropper here. You click on that, and then you would just click right on that gray area that you would see, and that will take care of it. It'll just pop that area to be the white portion of the image, and that takes care of that. Now if you leave those in, every time you use the brush later on, you'll see a very faint, strange angular area or strange shape below the brush spot, and it becomes very distracting. Now before we turn this into a brush, we'll go to Image, Trim, just to keep it as nice and small and lean as possible. Okay, now we'll go to Edit, Define Brush Preset, and let's call this My Brush Stroke 1. There we go. And we see this here. If we open up the Brushes panel and go to Brush Presets, it's all the way down here at the bottom of your brushes, and it says My Brush Stroke 1. So what does this do for us? Well, it does a couple of things. Let's start with a new file first. I'll just default Photoshop size, but we'll increase the size of it there. Now by default, Photoshop has already given us our custom brush here as our brush tip. I have the brush selected, but we're painting with white, so that doesn't really do anything. If we swap the colors again to black, you can see it gives us a nice black paint stroke. Now this brush tip is also responds to all the other brush commands that you would have. So if you hold down the Alt and the right mouse button, you can reduce the diameter of it. Now you'll notice if you click and drag, it doesn't really seem to offer a very good result. These type of brush textures, as you use them, really work more as like a stamp. So you don't want to necessarily paint with them. You want to just click and stamp them where they need to be. Let's put some color in there. Nice blue strokes. There's some really good things you can do with these now too. Let's open up our brushes panel. Now I do happen to have a pressure sensitive tablet here, and that does come in handy even though we're not painting necessarily with them. Make sure we're on My Brush Stroke 1. I'm going to engage the shape dynamics. Okay, I have the size jitter set to just over 10%. The angle jitter, now this is the one that I think is really helpful. I have this set to pen tilt. And what that does, let me show you real quick before I explain the rest. If I use my pen, now I can control the angle that I want that stamp to stamp in just by angling or tilting the pen on my tablet. Alright, I'm also engaging the flip X jitter and the flip Y jitter. So that will sort of randomly, let's drag it this time, flip them back and forth and create a more random appearance and a little bit more natural, so it's not quite as uniform if you end up using these a lot. So that's how you set up just one of the brushes. Now, if you notice that we scanned in quite a few of these, and I'm not going to do this all on camera here, but I went ahead and took the liberty of defining each of these as a brush preset. You may have noticed it if you were watching on my brush preset window. I get all these brush strokes. I've got 12 of them set up. So let's close all this and start working on something that's actually productive with these. So we've got these paintbrushes all set up, all loaded up. So I've prepared a mock-up to use for this called CustomBrushes, where we have a couple of really nice text layers called CustomBrushes, and then we've got a paintbrush image here in the shadow of the paintbrush there, and a nice deep dark background. Now what I want to do is use our new fun brushes to create sort of a painted backing to this image and make it look really almost hand done, sort of brushed in there with an actual real media brush. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a new layer for the lighter areas, the lighter brush strokes. Let's set our brush color to sort of a very pale white. I'm going to reduce the brush opacity to maybe about 74% and set this on screen. Now you may be wondering, why am I setting the brush mode itself on screen and not the layer? That's because if you do it only on the layer, the brush strokes will not interact with each other. They all sort of get laid down flatly, and then the layer itself interacts with the other layers. By setting it up here in the mode of the actual brush, each brush stroke individually reacts to the brush strokes underneath it. So let's reduce our brush here, and I'm going to turn this, to the painting set here. Make sure our shape dynamics is set. Okay, so now we'll just sort of begin adding these in, and you can see how each paint stroke is reacting with the other paint strokes around it. Reduce the opacity maybe a little bit more. All right, now it is beginning to become rather repetitive at this point. So the thing to do is go and select one of those other brush strokes. And just keep dabbing away. I think some of these are actually a little bit too strong. So I'm going to pick yet another brush here. That one's nice. Oops. Make sure my control is already on, and then pick even a darker color. And put it on multiply. And as you go along, you'll get a better feel for the way that the pen is set up for the angle of it. I like that bordering now. I think that looks pretty cool. I think it's time to go back to a lighter one now. Sort of blend it in a little bit more. Set this back to screen. And pull that opacity down quite a bit, so it gives just a much more subtle painted effect. Now you'll probably notice that the brushes there is a little difficult to read. I've got something for that. We create yet another new layer, and now use a darker gray. And this time I am going to set the layer also to multiply. And I'll set this one to soft light. Keep the opacity low. Oh, I want to use a different brush tip because we've got so many that we got to create. Might as well use them. All right, let's set that back over to white to lighten up underneath the custom quite a bit. Reverse it again, darken under the brushes. And ultimately, we end up with a pretty neat effect using these custom brush tips. I think it should be a little lighter over here. Oh, you could end up just playing with this for hours. Now also keep in mind that these are not just for brushes. Any of the Photoshop tools that use the painting engine can also use these tips. For instance, let's say we want to use the eraser. Pull that opacity down. Let's use this one over here. There, to remove some of those edges, perhaps. So always keep that in mind, that the brush engine can use any of the brush tips that are available. So that means the blur tool, the dodge tool, the burn tool, even the mixer brush tool, all those can use these custom brush tips that we created right from scanning in actual custom brush strokes.